Alright, welcome back everyone to part 2 of the Dragoborne Rally to War box opening video. After the last video I was struggling to find enough content just staying neutral about the rules itself, but now that I'm willing to share my opinion on the game, I think I'll have a lot more to say. Now of course these are all just first impressions. Haven't even had a chance to play the game yet, but just looking at the rules I immediately have some concerns. So, I think one thing that a lot of people were concerned about, just based on the comments I saw, looking at a like how to play Dragoborne video series on YouTube that was actually put out by the creators of the game themselves. A lot of people seem to dislike the flipping over the top card of your deck as like a resource card at the start of each of your turns. The concern was, what if I flip over my best card, and immediately I just see that it is unusable for the rest of the game? And I'll admit that actually was something that I thought of when I first heard the rule, but I don't think it's quite as much of a problem as some people seem to think it is, or thought. I doubt there's very many people thinking about this game at all these days. But the odds of a card being on the top of your deck at the start of your turn and then becoming unplayable because it's been flipped into a resource is pretty much just the same as the odds of that same card being on the bottom of your deck and then you just never reach it, because in Dragoborne you have a 50 card deck. So unless there's like a ton of draw power or like searching cards, if a card's on the bottom of your deck, you're just not going to see it. So that didn't really bother me. If anything, it seemed like an interesting idea to balance multicolored decks in a game where you're guaranteed to constantly gain more resources. In Magic the Gathering, if you're playing a multicolored deck, you have to be worried about what your lands can produce and how reliably you'll be able to draw those lands. In a game without a dedicated resource card, how do you balance, you know, the payoff for having a multicolored deck that has access to all sorts of different powerful effects across multiple different colors with the threat of not having the proper colors to pay for those cards? Especially when your banners, which you start the game in play with, your banners also provide colored resources. So I think having to randomly select your resource cards off the top of the deck, not really that bad. Another concern was the randomness brought about by the dice, and this is a complaint that I actually agree with, because it's added randomness without a whole lot of like depth. There's not a whole lot that it does. It doesn't feel too interesting. So you have these dice that you roll at the start of each turn. If you put them on a creature to Drago cross them, that's what it's called when you buff them by putting a card on it, they just get +1/+1, regardless of the result on the die. So in that instance, there's really not any randomness. It's just a resource to balance. And it could have just as easily been like little colored buttons or something. Like, it doesn't matter. If you use a die for Drago shielding, then the number on the die is the health of the shield. And that actually does matter. Especially in a game where you start with 3 mana, guaranteed, and you're allowed to attack with a creature the turn that you summon it. So on the second turn of the game, the player who is going second can immediately attack the player that's going first. And if you didn't like roll some decent Drago shields, then your opponent could just immediately start breaking some of your barriers and get like a massive head start. Especially since you're only allowed to block with a creature if that creature is in the fort that's under attack, but you can attack any fort, regardless of where the creature starts off. The other random aspect of the dice is like passive effects that trigger, say, if you have a yellow die with results between 4 and 6, then get this extra effect. I guess that's another way of balancing multicolored decks. You're more likely to get something like that because it's really just a 50-50. A lot of the effects that I saw, yeah, this one has one right here. Put the top card of your deck into your resource zone, and then if you have a yellow die, is that yellow? Let me get a closer look in person. I honestly don't know how I can't tell the difference between like yellow, white, and black. It feels like it could be any of them. It's so weird. It looks yellow on the camera. It doesn't matter. Anyway, if you have a certain die between 5 or 6, then put the top card of your deck into your resource zone and put one of your resources on top of your deck. So that's actually interesting. That immediately kind of alleviates the concern I was talking about that some people had about not being able to play certain cards. It's cool that they interacted with that. That's actually, I like that card design. This card has all sorts of different numbered effects. And as you can see, it's not really like, okay, red die 1 to 3 deal 4 damage instead, red die 4 to 6 deal 5 damage instead, and then an additional effect with a black die 1 to 2. So the randomness of the die rolls doesn't seem to matter that much that often. Like you saw on that card, as long as you have a red die, you're getting the bonus effect. And the only difference is one single damage. So when you're barely using the randomness and it's just such a mild change, it feels like it's something that's not going to result in moments that are too exciting. It's just going to alienate people that are super competitive and want a game with minimal randomness. And it's just going to cause more frustration if you happen to lose to like a really specific random effect, like that one damage difference is enough to either, like, it's the difference between killing a creature or not. And then suddenly you lose your last blocker, your opponent attacks, and that's game. Now, I think I was kind of getting into this when I was talking about like using Drago shielding to block and how you really have to rely on that in the early game. But another problem I had is that the columns system, like you have these 3 different forts, and your opponent has 3 forts, and you put creatures in your forts, and you put ambushes in front of your forts, and each fort has its own barriers. But then it barely feels like it matters because creatures can attack any fort regardless of where they're placed. So you don't end up feeling like you're playing these 3 very distinct engagements, like fort versus fort, and you're trying to manage them all with one singular deck of cards in one singular hand. And then you might have situations where you need to start focusing more on one fort. You have to kind of surrender some losses in the other fort, maybe take a hit to your barriers. Not entirely sure what they could have done to fix that. I mean, obviously, you could just say that you can only attack the fort directly in front of you, but then the problem is, when a certain fort in a certain column falls, like, what are you supposed to do at that point? Obviously, you still need the space to play the extra creatures, so you can't just say that column is now unusable. But then, I don't know. It just feels like another system where, similar to the dice, it adds a bit of complexity to the game and makes it feel different from other games. But then the system perhaps isn't quite as meaningful as it could be, so it's just added complexity without added depth. My real concern with luck in this game is not even about the dice, which is weird because it's such a fundamental mechanic to the game, but it's actually about the shield burst or fort burst or whatever it was called. So the cards you get as your barriers are just randomly selected. It's just off the top of your deck at the start of the game. And a handful of cards have the fort burst effect where if they're flipped as If they're flipped as a barrier, or they're broken as a barrier, then they get to trigger effect for free. It just seems like it could be really swingy, especially when it's luck-based. I think a similar way to have like a comeback system and some exciting moments, and maybe make your opponent think twice about just immediately swinging in unless they have a really stable board state. And this could help slow the game down when, you can already attack without summoning sickness, and you can attack any fort you please, even if your opponent doesn't have a creature in that fort to defend it. So a system that I liked the idea of is having a separate like barrier deck. So you have your 50 card main deck, and then I don't know, maybe the minimum size is like 15 or something. At the start of the game, you shuffle up your main deck, you draw your hand from it and whatnot, and you also shuffle up your barrier deck and then deal cards from that deck to the forts as barriers. And all of the cards from the barrier deck have a fort burst effect. And then the power level can also be kept a bit more flat. All of the cards can be roughly equivalent because there is no cost to playing them. They're just played for free. Anyway, I guess that's all the packs, and conveniently, I got through everything that I actually had to say about the game for now. I do have another booster box of this to open. Set Gears of Apocalypse, that's the third booster set. Anyway, perhaps by then, I'll have actually had a chance to get some games in. I think Dragoborne is on the online client untap.in. Maybe I'll find someone to play with. And then I'll have some more thorough opinions to give about the game. But anyway, I probably won't be able to record that for at least a week, so that'll be a little ways off. But if you liked this, I hope you wait for the next one. And if you do, I'll see you then.